want to talk about today is product development. And what I'd like to do is introduce to you how I think about what the job is. So what is the role of a product leader? I'd like to share with you two frameworks that I have found super helpful in building great companies, whether they're at the startup stage or they're evolving. And I'll explain those two frameworks within two cases. One at Netflix, and the second is a younger startup called Chegg, which is a textbook rental company. So I'm going to begin with talking about what it is to be a product leader. And the simplest definition that I have is you love to build stuff. You love to build products and companies and organizations. And your job is to delight customer in margin-enhancing, hard-to-copy ways. Now, the margin-enhancing is just a simple way, or a fancy way, rather, of saying in a way that helps create money or builds shareholder value. And this is the heart of something I'll explain to you later, which I call the DMH model. You notice the delight, the margin, and the hard copy. So the thing to think about is what are the skills of a product leader? And in this case, I'm sharing an archetypal leader, Steve Jobs. But you can think for a moment, what are his skills and what are the things that enabled him to anticipate what customers would want in the future and build just wonderfully elegant, simple products that you've gotten used to with Apple. So when I think about the job, I think about a list of product management skills, PM skills. And here I've shared with you what I find helpful, the skills of being able to do the job. So the first is technical. You work well with technology partners. Management is really building systems and processes to build stuff that consumers love. Creative skills are the lifeblood of what you do. And then having some sense of how to build a business, how to figure out how to create shareholder value in building a great startup or a great company. The next idea is marketing, and that's packaging and positioning ideas in ways that resonate with customers. My first hit product was Elmo's Preschool, and the idea was that we were creating a full preschool curriculum for the parents of a 3 or 4-year-old. They'd have that whole curriculum on their PC at home. Design's all about creating simple things that resonate. It got particularly hard in the last 5 to 10 years of how do you create simple designs that work on a tiny little framework that is your phone, for instance. The last idea that's critical for these technical skills of a product manager is what I call consumer science. And that's qualitative focus groups, trying to get inside the heads of consumers. It's survey data, what they say they like or don't. Digging in the dirt with empirical data, looking for trends and the behavior, how people use products. But the big dog is A/B testing. And the idea, for instance, Netflix recently did a test where they put 100,000 members into a test. And instead of giving the 5-star system that everyone was used to, they did a thumbs up and thumbs down. And they realized they got twice the taste input from folks because of that change. And that was revealed through an A/B test. And that's really been the thing that's provided meaningful insight over the last 5 or 10 years. And I call that better living through math. On the other side of the equation are the leadership skills. So I have grown up to be a VP or a chief product officer at different companies. And in that role, it's the same as the skills that are needed for a head of finance or a head of marketing. So I'm going to describe these skills in a moment. The first is leadership. And I describe that as having an inspired vision of the future that everyone can get behind. Management, can I build organizations, teams? Can I hire the right people? Strategy is perhaps the most important skill of these product leaders, and I'm going to talk about that a fair amount today. And then in most of the companies that I've worked with, there's this mix between proactive, results-oriented, everybody grab a shovel to help deliver the results, against a little bit more thought and care in defining the softer issues of a company, the culture. Business maturity is another skill I look for, and that's just great decisions around people, product, and the business. And the last thing that I look for is domain expertise. So at this point, I have substantial domain expertise in both kids and education and in entertainment, whether it's bang bang shoot 'em ups with electronic arts or encouraging you to do too much binge watching with Netflix. So that's how I think about the product leader's job. And what I want to do today is talk about two really important frameworks that have been super helpful, and I'll apply them in two different contexts. One is Netflix, that I'm hoping that most of you are members, I'm hoping that you're supporting the future medical school skill bills of my daughter, and they're almost done with college. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Netflix, and then later I will share that and another startup that I've helped to build, which is called Chegg. So let's move on to dear Netflix. I just want to nicely remind folks of the brief history of Netflix for a moment. So Netflix, and I really just want to bring you back to Netflix at some point was just a punk startup. So in 1997, the co-founder of Netflix, Mark Randolph, bought an audio CD for himself in the music store in Santa Cruz. And then he sent it to himself in the mail, and he was delighted that when he got it, it was playable. It wasn't scratched, and that gave him the insight at the moment that DVD players were being born, that this DVDs could go back and forth through the mail, which was not practical with the damn VCR or VHS tapes. But this was the initial seed of an idea. The company went public very early, 600,000 subscribers in IPO. It was tough because at that time there was an anthrax scare, so people were afraid to open their envelopes for fear of white dust falling out and dying. It was rough. In 2007, we launched what was called Watch Instantly on the PC, and that was the beginning of streaming, which I'm sure you're all used to. But then it was only on your Windows PC. It used Silverlight. It was not easy to use, and there weren't very many good titles. By 2013, there was a big investment, a big bet by Netflix in creating original content. I'm sure most of you have seen House of Cards and, of course, watched the recent challenges. Netflix just suspended it because of Kevin Spacey's behavior. 2017 was a big year for Netflix, got to 100 million members worldwide. So it's well on its way in 20 years of becoming a truly great company. And that's the goal for starters, to build a company that will dent the universe. So as a nice reminder to any entrepreneurs out there, all startups stink at the beginning. So this is what Netflix looked like in 1999. If you look carefully, there were 2,600 DVDs you could rent. Cost about $4 for each disc to get back and forth in the mail. And it didn't take one day, as it did in recent past. It took actually 4 or 5 days. But this was the beginning genesis. And then if I share some of the evolutions along the way, this is what it looked like. By this point, I was at Netflix. This is 2007. And you can see that we're sort of working it out. And right now, it's on the movies you'll heart area. And this is where we began to experiment with personalization. This was sort of the sandbox, if you will, for Todd Yellen, who was the personalization product manager, to begin to experiment on how could you uniquely connect people with the movies that they'll love based on a knowledge of their movie tastes. This is what the site looks like today. And actually, if you look super carefully, you'll discover it's not for me. It's for my 21-year-old daughter, Kelsey. Because, of course, I'm not way into Grey's Anatomy or Gossip Girl. But this is an example of a wonderfully personalized site where you can get stuff instantly. So getting from that stinky site in 1997 to what it looks like today was in no way easy. What I want to share with you is some of the thinking about the product strategy that helped inform lots of different decisions about how to build a product that we hoped hundreds of thousands and then millions of people would love. So just as a quick refresh, strategy, the way I think about it is simply a plan to achieve a long-term goal. But another way to think about it in the context of product development is you create various hypotheses for how you might build both customer and shareholder value. So I'm going to share with you shortly some of those hypotheses. And then at the next level down, the strategy informed what tactics. In the world of product development, I think of tactics as essentially being projects or experiments against some of those high-level hypotheses. So today, when I share with you some of the thinking behind Netflix and Chegg, you'll see a theme of ideas about different theories or hypotheses, the strategies, and then you'll notice lots of experiments and projects that help to see if those hypotheses were true. Why was strategy so important? I found it to be one of the most important ways to get everybody in the building aligned and focused on the most important things that they could do to both build customer and shareholder value. And you'll see I'm always focused on how do you make it motivating, how do you make folks in the building understand how big this startup could get. And really what I love about it, as companies get bigger, they start bringing in rules and process, which I really don't like at all. Strategy helps enable discipline without any of that process or rules. And then if you're a product leader or a product manager, at the simplest level, you're trying to create a list of things that you think will delight your customers. And I could have hundreds of ideas. And so the strategy helps you to prioritize, to figure out of the 100 ideas, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 most important ideas. And then the job is to actually execute those ideas in prioritized order. And strategy informs most of this thinking. It's a tough job. Your job is to say no a lot. And that's one of the big challenges for me. Okay, so I've got 2 models for you. The first I call Glee, and it'll be evident in a second why I call it that. I don't know if folks have watched the episodic TV show called Glee, but it was a bit of an inspiration for the name of this model. This is a way to think about how does a company get from here in the very early days, in that stinky phase of starting, to becoming a great company over time. So the G stands for get big on something. And then the next chapter of a company's life, I think of that as you're going to lead that next thing. And then the E in Glee is after that second chapter, you're going to expand into something even bigger. So I'll share with you how I thought about this in the context of Netflix. So for me, the first step in this Glee model was to get big on DVDs. So Netflix by 2007, 2008, 2010 was super big, where there's 100,000 DVDs you could choose from, and it would show up the next day in the mail. And that was the foundation that let the company go on to the next stage of its life, which is to lead downloading. Now, this is some of the wording that I used back in 2005. If you used the word streaming, for instance, customers thought you were using the word streamlining. That sounded really bad. The idea of streaming wasn't invented as a term until maybe 2008, 2009. But the thinking was after the company had begun the transition from DVDs to streaming, then and only then could it expand worldwide. And the really cool thing about this idea of focus and phasing, there's actually been a 4th chapter in Netflix's life, where today it's gone into original content. So I've just described the sort of 4 or 5 year chapters of the company's life, getting from that really stinky looking website in the late 90s to the experience that you can have today. So that's the illustration of the Glee model in the context of Netflix. And what I love about this is it gets startups and companies thinking not just about how you can get big tomorrow, but how you can get even bigger 3, 4, or 5 years from now. And you can think of lots of examples of companies that didn't essentially find that next wave, as Jeff Kagan talks about here. Yahoo, for instance, it grew the wave of bringing lots of media property to the internet, but it didn't find its next big thing. And so now it's not a big, great company, which is the aspiration if you're an entrepreneur. The DMH model. So I won't make it a mystery novel here. The D stands for delight, and the M stands for margin enhancement, or creating a business. And the H model stands for hard to copy. So I'll share my thinking here. So the simple idea is the DMH model gets you thinking about how can you delight customers in margin enhancing, hard to copy ways. The important insight here is, yes, it's frankly never easy to figure out how to delight a customer, and it's rarely easy to build the things that delight them. But when I'm working with teams, I'm always giving extra bonus points for the things that it's super hard to copy, because I'm keenly aware of anything that's not hard to copy, the startup down the street will copy the work. So I'll get you thinking for a moment about this model in the context of Netflix. So you can think for a moment about what are all the things that delight you as a member. I hope you are a member. But imagine what it was to be thinking about all these things back in 2005. So I'm going to give you a list of all the theories and hypotheses about how we hoped that we could delight customers. Personalization we thought was important. Delivering the disc the next day in the mail to you was important. super important in the context of streaming. Only recently, in the last year or so, did Netflix begin to delight customers where if you look at the item, the last on the list, you could download it and then play it back later. So that's a new area where customers are delighted. The margin enhancement at Netflix, this was hard. So in the old days, it was people would get 3 discs sitting on top of their DVD player to choose from, and the plan cost $22 a month. And it took us many years of insight to understand that no, they didn't all need 3 discs to choose from. They could have a 2-disc plan at a time or a 1-disc plan at a time. And we gradually learned how to bring the service down to $8 or $9 or $10. Today, you can stream all you want for $10. Finding and discovering that business model along the way was the result of lots of experiments, lots of A/B tests. And so I'm just sharing some of the thoughts that we had back in 2005. We were forever testing these different plans and prices. At some point, we actually had advertising on the site for 2 years. That was a business model experiment. We would have lots of new release discs. After y'all watched them, 3 months after they came out in the theater, the demand would drop off and we would sell those used discs. These were all experiments in how to make a business that works, where we could actually be profitable. Long tail content, that is it refers to a very specific thing to the movie industry, which is if I could help you find a new release movie, that was easy. Most people like blockbuster movies. It costs something like $3 to send that disc back and forth in the mail to you. But if I could help you find a movie that you'd love that was over a year old, it only costs us $1 to send back and forth in the mail. So one of the keys at Netflix was helping to connect you with movies that you'd love, but that might be a little older because the economics were substantially better. These were all things that we learned over time, largely through constant A/B tests. The hard to copy. So think for a moment in the world of technology, what's hard to copy? And they typically come down to 4 key ideas. So the first is brand. So today, I think people know and love Netflix. They're certainly willing to give over their credit card information in a way that they wouldn't for some punk startup. Network effects are super important. We actually experimented with creating a friends network. You'd get movie ideas from your friends. Turns out that was a failure. But the network effect, the virtuous cycle that Netflix was able to create, was one where today every TV device that you buy will let you stream Netflix instantly. Of course, you can do it on your iPhone or Android or any other device. So think about the incredible network effect where today every hardware manufacturer streams Netflix. That's a very hard thing for some punk startup to come along and to copy. And that's the result of a substantial virtuous cycle and a network effect. Netflix has got lots of unique technology. Netflix knows the tastes of 100 million people worldwide. It knows that people in France actually love a good Hollywood blockbuster film. That's insight it's gotten through its personalization technology. It is able to predict the movie tastes of all of its members to assess whether they should make an investment in some new episodic TV series. And the other huge advantage that Netflix has today is essentially economies of scale. So today, Netflix can afford to spend $200 million in an episodic TV series called The Crown because it's so big, because it has 100 million members. And Hulu, for instance, cannot make that same level of investment. So these are the 4 things that I look for. And I've given you examples of how we thought about that in the context of Netflix and how we worked to define strategies and these high-level hypotheses that would be wonderfully hard to copy over time. So I've defined a list of hypotheses here. These were all ideas of what we thought we needed to do in order to delight customers in these margin-enhancing and hard-to-copy ways. There's plans, and there's theories, and there's hypotheses, and then there's realities. So in a moment, I'm going to share with you, what worked and what didn't work. And that's the lifeblood of product development, this constant experimentation. So if you look here, I've highlighted in green all the things that work. Personalization worked, instant worked. But I've also shown some of the failures. So you'll look here, And you'll notice that in 2007, we tested exclusive content that you could only watch on Netflix. That failed. But by 2012, when there was a larger economy of scale, something like original content from House of Cards was a big success. And so I'm just trying to reinforce here that helping to get a company from nowhere and helping it to become big and a big enough company to dent the universe is a result of constant and ongoing tests. Because at the end of the day, figuring out what will delight a customer is hard. And you will find yourself experimenting over years. All right, so I'm going to share with you in a minute what I shared in 2005 when I would stand up in front of the company and say, this is what we're going to focus on. This is how I think about strategy and what defines what's important or what's not. And so you'll notice that I'm going to show how the Glee model got played out, this DMH model. And I'm also going to do one last thing, which is show how the projects, these tactics, went up against these high-level strategies. And I'm going to show the metrics that we use to measure whether or not we were making progress against those things. Because if we couldn't show our ability to move the metrics, it was usually a sign that it was a failed hypothesis, and then we would simply kill it, move on to the next thing. So imagine it's 2005, and I stand up in front of the room and say, hey, I'm here. My job is to optimize retention against the cost of doing that. For perspective, in the early days of Netflix, about 8% of the members were quitting each month. Today, that's about 2%. So there's substantial improvement in retention over the years. It's fascinating. Today, those 2% who cancel each month, it's one of two things. There's no money in their account, or it's summer, and they're feeling a little bit guilty for doing as much binge watching as they are. But this was at the highest level. This defined my job at Netflix for those 5 years. I've already revealed to you how I helped the whole company understand these different chapters of the company's life, the initial focus on getting big on DVD, and then how we were going to transition to leading downloading, and finally how we would expand worldwide. So now what I want to share with you is what I likely might have shared way back then. So I'm going to look smart for a second, and then I'm going to show some of the failures that happened along the way. So imagine I say, hey, we're going to focus on a lot of experiments, projects, because we think personalization is super important. We believe that getting a disc the next day in the mail and later streaming is super important. We have to figure out how to make money, so we'll be engaged in lots of margin enhancement experiments. And then there was a simple idea that turned out to be really important, which is we're going to create a simple experience. So the startup was born out of Silicon Valley freaks, not normal. It was way too complex, certainly for my mother. But the aspiration is if we were going to become a worldwide product, a brand, we had to keep things easy. And at each turn, every time we A/B tested something simple versus more complex, and most of the time, the simple one. So that was just an insight from how we got along the way. So I talked a little bit about projects. So for instance, a substantial progress against personalization was the Netflix Prize. I don't know if folks will remember it, but we had one engineer focused on collaborative filtering. That's a tactic for connecting you with movies that you'd love. We said, hey, we'll give $1 million to anybody who can improve the collaborative filtering algorithm. And a couple of years later, we had level of magnitude 5,000 engineers working on that problem, which was way cool. That was a project against personalization. There were many others. We got engaged in something called quantum theory. We had folks in LA that were tagging all the specific types of movies, whether it was filmed in Stonington, Connecticut, or had a strong female heroine, sort of analogous to what Pandora does with this Music Genome Project. But the point here is against all of these high-level strategies, at any moment in time, there were a number of tactics against them. And the next important idea was that we were measuring whether or not we were making progress against each of these strategies along the way. So for instance, our proxy metric for measuring whether we were making progress in personalization, the simple question was, if people rated a lot, it was a clue to us that they must value the personalization, that we're providing better movie choices. So our proxy metric, it was simple. It said at the end of a customer's first 6 weeks, what percentage have rated at least 50 movie ratings? And frankly, in this one, most people would guess it was 0 or 2%. And so they're quite astounded to learn that the metric, we got it up to about 20 or 25%. But that was a clue to us that customers valued the personalization. It was a proxy metric. Of course, in the long term, we could measure whether it improved retention. But retention tests are big, they're long-standing, and very few companies have the time and patience to wait. And this is why we had a proxy metric for each of these strategies. Another one, for instance, was how do you measure if easy is working? So our metric was, if you think back to the era of DVD by mail, when you first signed up for the website experience, the question was what percent of customers added at least 3 titles to their queue in their very first session. That's the session where they've handed over the credit card. It was super important to understand how to get titles into your queue. And in the early days, that was at, say, 80% in their first session added at least 3 titles to their queue. But after we experimented, et cetera, we got to a place where that 92% of customers were adding at least 3 titles to their queue. And eventually, that helped to improve retention. So this is just an illustration how we measured our success along the way. Just want to reinforce just a couple of things here. I've talked about the different chapters of Netflix life, from DVD to streaming on all TVs worldwide. And now they're in the era of original content. They're essentially trying to out HBO before HBO tries to out Netflix. But if you think about that high-level theory and hypothesis of personalization, it turns out it's been incredibly important. In the early days, it helped to connect you with DVDs you love, but also the cheaper versions, and that helped build the business. In the era of streaming, think about when we first had a streaming library. In 2007, we began to enable you to watch movies instantly via streaming. At the same time, you were getting a lot of DVDs in the mail. And what was so helpful about personalization was we really didn't have very many streaming titles available. And personalization helped you to find just a few diamonds in the rough in that small library. And then today, when Netflix makes investments in original content, they know everyone's movie tastes, and they know whether they should make a $300 million investment in Stranger Things or a $10 million investment in some wonderful new story, but they know that it's just for a much smaller audience. So I've sort of shown how this theory of personalization was critically important across these 3 chapters of Netflix's life, which I think is way cool. But that's defined by this high-level theory of personalization and how it would delight customers in these margin-enhancing, hard-to-copy ways. I said I was going to look smart for a minute and then reveal that we weren't that smart. So there were lots of failed hypotheses. So when I showed you how all the red failed, we had a substantial theory that a more entertaining experience would improve retention. Half of my team was worried that we were essentially building an automated vending machine for movies, and we needed to differentiate ourselves and make it more special. And more special would be a more entertaining experience. If you used the PlayStation 3, Max you boot it up, and Max was there talking to you and helping you to find great movie choices. He was sort of a movie genie. Well, it turns out that it did not improve retention. And if you look at the site today, an automated vending machine that's super simple was really the thing that improved retention. So this was a failed theory hypothesis, and most people fall over when they realize that we invested a year or 2 in this before we discovered it really wasn't a great idea. But that is the hard part about product development. Another failed hypothesis, we thought that we could build a network effect where you would connect with all your friends who use Netflix, and your friends would suggest movie ideas for you. And you wouldn't leave Netflix because you didn't want to leave any of your friends. So it's a valid theory. You know, think about how wonderful this theory has worked for Facebook and building this great network effect. The challenge for Netflix is that your friends have sneaky movie tastes. And so, in fact, very few people engaged in this service. Of course, we thought we could fix that through math. We couldn't. We invested 3 years in this idea of friends and getting good movie choices. and building a network effect, it turned out to be a failed theory. At the end of the day, only 8% of our members engaged in that, and that wasn't enough to actually improve retention. Welcome to product development. It's hard. All right, so what I'd like to do is take you to another story. And I'm going to apply those same models for you. Now, you've all heard of Netflix, and I'm hoping you're all subscribers. Chegg, today, it's a textbook rental company. So students are saving a few hundred, probably $500 million a year renting textbooks from Chegg instead of buying them. So I'm going to share with you how I thought about this startup, how I thought about these two different models that I've explained, and how I thought about the overall product strategy at a substantially younger company. And I'm guessing that I've got a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs out there. So I'm going to give you a younger company as an example. Chegg was born, the founder, Ayush, couldn't get a job because he had no experience. He couldn't get an experience because he didn't have a job. And he described it as a chicken and an egg problem. And out of this is the name of the company, which is called Chegg. If I give you the brief history, Ayush started the company in 2001 at Iowa State. And if you looked at it, it was sort of Craigslist for college students. And the aspiration was that students could buy and sell their used couches on campus. It turned out that didn't work very well. But he did manage to attract a little venture capital funding from a few Silicon Valley investors. And then finally, through lots of experimenting and trying different things that would appeal to students, there was an experiment with, hey, instead of students buying either new textbooks or used textbooks, they can rent them. And it turned out that that idea worked. So if you joined the company in 2008 or 2009, every new employee walked through the desk, Ayush would say, hey, can I borrow your credit card? Would buy a textbook on Dear Amazon, send it to the student and say, hey, when you're done, send it back. And that was an early proof of concept for this idea of textbook rental. And by 2010, this is when I joined the company, Chegg had managed to rent 2 million textbooks, which was a substantial proof of concept that the startup was on its way. Today, the company's probably approaching $300 million in revenues. It's public, and it's worth almost $2 billion. So from an entrepreneur's point of view, it's off to a great start. So the history here, did I mention that all startups stink at the beginning? So this is what Chegg looked like in the early days. You can see there's a lot of stuff going on. They're still trying to find their way. And so you could look for furniture or computers or electronics or calculators, any number of things. And this was not working. But with the insight from the early tests, the textbook rental was working. So this is what it looked like in 2010. Still not a clean, simple, well-lit place. But the cool thing was it was really working. So when I started to sort of tire kick the company, I went to San Jose State and I found a post office on the campus just full of these big orange boxes. And it was a wonderful way to virally build this brand. And of course, I thought it was analogous to Netflix. At first, Netflix back and forth with discs in the mail, and then streaming. I thought it would work out with eTextbooks next. So I joined the company. And then just like Netflix got a little bit better as you learn what was important and not to customers. You can see the company evolving slowly into a well-lit place. Again, simpler and simpler because it knows now that it's all about textbook rental. And this is what the site looks like today. So I'm going to give you just a teeny bit more history on the company, and then I'm going to apply those two different models for you. So Chegg, a little bit different from Netflix in that it's a mission-driven education company. It's really about the goodness of the students. Students are kind of hosed. The publishers aren't looking out for them. You go into a campus bookstore and all you find are really expensive new books, which you may or may not need in class. So the idea was that Chegg came along and it was focused on the students and essentially made students first, that we're on the side of students. And then the theory was that over time, if we brought all the students across the United States on board, eventually the publishers and the schools and even their teachers would follow. And that, in some part, has begun to happen today. So I'm going to talk about the chapters of the Glee model for Chegg. So the first idea was that we were going to get big on textbook rental. And that has happened, and it's going exceptionally well. And the next theory, very analogous to Netflix, was that we were going to lead e-textbooks. There's going to be a transition from paper textbooks to digital. And then the step after that was that we would expand via something we called the student network. So the idea was we could build, Facebook's a social network. We were going to create and connect students across the country and eventually the world together. And then at that point, we could provide lots of different student services. So this was the initial theory about how we would grow over time in these different phases and chapters. I crack up Ashton Kutcher when he debuted on 2.5 Men. If you look carefully, you see the Chegg sticker. So it was like, go get them, guys. A little free advertising for us. So I got a big kick out of that. All right. So the theory wasn't quite correct. If you look here, it turns out that the transition to e-textbook wasn't near as quick as I hoped or thought it would be. And if you look carefully at the screenshot, the main reason was that we couldn't get the cooperation of the New York-based publishers. And so look carefully, a student could rent a textbook for $92, or they could get the e-textbook for $122. And so that just wasn't helping us. We couldn't get the rights at a price that we needed. So we had to revise our thinking a little bit. So the second chapter of Chegg's life was to lead digital student services. And I'll show you in a minute how that played out. Think of that as essentially homework help services. So over time, we enabled the students they could get the answers, step-by-step solutions for all the questions in the back of their textbooks. They could reach out to online tutors and other folks to help them with homework. So, my initial theory was it was going to go textbook rental to e-textbooks. I was wrong. Chapter 2 of the company is lead these digital student services, and today they're on their way towards building that student network. So think about how the DMH model was applied here. If you look carefully at the textbook display page on a site, you see a lot of things that delight customers. So in this case, instead of buying a new textbook for $311, which is a total ripoff, you'll notice that a student could rent the textbook for only $27.99. Or another thing that delighted students was that they had up to 21 days to return the textbook. So they would show up at their class and then learn they didn't need that textbook. In fact, it wasn't used at all. They could return it to us. These are examples of some of the things that we discovered that delighted customers over time. A last example, we did manage to deliver the textbook instantly. We got the rights for a free trial of an e-textbook for the student. So they essentially, the digital delivery was instant, and that was really delightful to a student. And the textbook would show up 2 or 3 days later. Building the business, the big question was, could we build a business that was profitable by buying a used textbook, which we did at scale, and then figuring out the right pricing to rent it, and then knowing that the students would return it. And over time, we proved a business model that was highly effective. And then in the later life of the company, we experimented with subscription services. So today, students, for about $15 a month, are getting this homework help service, which is very high margin. And it's working quite well. So what's the stuff that's hard to copy about Chegg? So if you think back to it, it's still the same things. Today, if you're on a campus and you notice the big orange boxes, you know that's Chegg. There's unique technology. Again, it's around personalization. The network effects is this concept of building a student network, and then there are economies of scale. Chegg is able to buy lots of used textbooks at a cost-effective way in order to pass on the savings via rental to students. So the core ideas are pretty similar. The idea of the brand was Chegg, we're going to put students first. Personalization was, again, important. We built this student hub, this network effect for the students. And the greatest area of economy scale was the ability to buy millions of used textbooks as an aggregator and then rent them back to the students, which was great. My job as product leader, pretty similar. So how effective could I be if a student rented a textbook in September, bringing that back in January? And that was the notion of 6-month retention. And for the homework help services, what percent would come back each month to enjoy this homework help service? And I would use another proxy, which is Net Promoter Score. So it took us a while, but we got our NPS up to 80, which is astounding. But it was showing that we were creating a lot of value for students and that students loved us. The product strategy. So think about me now standing up in 2010 saying, hey, company, hey, team, these are the things that these are the high-level theories and hypotheses about how we think we can delight customers in these margin-enhancing, hard-to-copy ways. So there was an important idea of a student graph. If we get all the data about who the students were and all the courses on a campus, and then all the textbooks for those courses, that was substantial data, we call it a student graph, that would enable us to create a personalized experience for customers. And then like Netflix, we did lots of price testing and also a lot of work on understanding what are the right textbooks to buy in order to rent back to students. And then substantial experimentation later with these monthly subscription services, the homework help. And so you can see here some of the example projects that we worked on at different times that over time did prove that these high-level strategies were helpful in building a great business. And very, very similar to Netflix, at any moment in time, we were measuring, are we making progress against these high-level theories and hypotheses? So for instance, that measure of student graph, at some point, 80% of the campuses with more than 1,000 students, we had the data on all the classes. And we also knew all the books that a student need in each of those classes. And this was a sort of a coverage metric that helped us, are we making progress against this notion of building a student graph? On the personalization, what percentage of students actually create an account and were logging in? We took that as a proxy that they must value that personalized experience. But again, the notion is that at any moment in time, we were measuring, are we making progress against these high-level strategies? And similar to Netflix, these were just high-level theories and hypotheses. We did not know what was going to work. So if you can remember what it was like in 2010, Groupon was a big deal. Local services, local deals was an incredible value. So we experimented with that, and that was a big failure for us. Did not work. And this is the job of constant experimentation. Companies like Warby Parker have substantial retail operations today. We tried that ourselves. This is a baby test of kiosks, of physical locations on campuses. And for us, that was a failure. So the notion here is you hope you have 6 high-level theories or hypotheses, and typically about 4 of those are proven out over time. To my mind, if I'm 4 out of 6 on these things, I'm like dancing on rooftops. So in all of this, what I've really been talking about is the journey of being an entrepreneur, of starting something that you hope will work, and then through experimentation of clear and articulate strategies, clear and articulate metrics that help measure whether you're making progress, and then frankly, a description. This is why I really like the Glee model, helping the whole company understand these chapters of the history and frankly how big it will get. Because one of the biggest challenges in startups is sometimes people lack the imagination to think about how a punk startup that starts with 8 or 10 people could actually grow into the world dominant force that you see at a company like Netflix today. So I have a juicy quote that sort of nicely reminds me about the job of being a product leader. And the quote is by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which is to say, my French is horrible, but he's the writer of The Little Prince. And the quote is, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea.